From Research Triangle Park in North Carolina and Silicon Valley in California, this is Content Evolution New World. I'm Kevin Clark, glad to have you with us. My co-host, Mike McGuire. Mike, how is the world treating you today?
Very nice. I've just got off the jet from the East Coast a couple of days ago, so readjusting to life on the West Coast and reading up on various court cases involving our technology company brethren. So it's all good.
All right, fantastic. We are delighted to have our guest speaker today, Martin Vilso with Implement Consulting Group out of Denmark. I've been helping Martin and his team, get ready, get seated here. All right, he's been doing a lot of it on its own, but I've been making introductions. And I might say that the original introduction was because of Joe Pine, because Joe, who is on the call with us today, is an advisor, right, not only to Content Evolution, but he's also an advisor to Implement. So Joe, thanks for making that connection. We've been trying to make things as friendly as we can for Implement here in their first US office. Before we go to Martin, Joe, anything you want to say about Implement? Make Martin blush, okay, with what you know about Implement.
I don't know if I can do that, but yeah, I've worked with Implement several times in Denmark, and was impressed, one, with the breadth of clients that they use and their focus on really helping them create greater value. And so I think I'm glad they're coming to the U.S. and try to help them find people. So I introduced them to you and hope they're a big success of it. Martin, are you in the U.S. now? Or are you still in
Yeah, I'm here now. I relocated with my family in July, so I'm now living in Raleigh. So we're here, and business is up and running, and yeah, I managed to hire 14 people so far. So we're moving.
Good.
Yeah.
He's got his kids enrolled in one of the best schools in the area, and he's growing his team, which is fantastic. We're going to talk about risk management. We're going to go back and forth here a little bit at the beginning because we've had several opportunities to talk about this topic, and then we're going to open up to all of you. Martin, anything you want to say about Implement and its presence around the world, and specifically why you're here before we dive into risk management?
Yeah, maybe just a brief introduction. I think Implement has been around for almost 30 years now, and it's a management consulting company, but with a twist. I think we've tried to carve out a niche in actually helping businesses. I think there's a slight challenge in the consulting world as we know it. That there's been a lot of good analysis done, but not always a lot of help on the sort of true transformation and change efforts that's required. And that's where we like to play, and that's sort of hidden in the name Implement. We like to stick around with the clients and actually implement the transformation that's required for whatever subject we're talking about. So that's where we've been carving out a niche, and it's been going well so far. We've got 1,600 consultants in Europe, and that continues to build. We then got more and more business around the world, so we're working all over the world right now, but with, of course, an outset from Scandinavia. And what happened in the US is just 5 or 6 years ago, we started to do a lot of work with General Motors in Detroit. And through that, our network in the US has just been building. And at the end, we got to a level where I said to the board of Implement, we need to do something different. It's getting a little bit out of hand. We can't keep flying forth and back. So we decided to set up our first US business, and we ended up here in Raleigh, which has been an amazing choice so far. There's a lot happening here, great talent here, and so on. And with the welcoming of Kevin through Joe, and so it's been a great success so far to meet people and network and figure out where we can best help businesses succeed. So that's a little bit about Implement, and then we can jump into the world of risk.
Well, actually, as we've talked about, this is one of the things that you're not only an expert in, but you have a lot of interest in, right? I mean, they don't always align, right? That that you delve. I've developed deep interest, expertise in this, but I'm not interested in it anymore, right? You're still interested in it, and I created the headline for us today, which is taking the risk out of risk management, because what I've gleaned from our conversations is that the way that some businesses are approaching risk management is actually pretty risky,
Yeah.
right? So, share kind of your overall thesis about where you think we are in the enterprise world with risk management.
Yeah, so I think that historically the world of risk has sort of been an attempt to create a comprehensive overview of any given risk that an organization may be standing in front of. And when we look at the answer to that, many companies have tried to create a risk management function, and then some processes that has been trying to get to an overview of risk. And I think fundamentally that's basically flawed. You can't build a function around risk. It has to be a capability across the enterprise. And I think that's one of the major sort of challenges here. At the same time, we got a world that's changing rapidly, and the process of risk management is very, very slow in most organizations in the way that it's set up. And it's the major output from risk management today is a report that goes to the board. It's not actually enabling any decision making, and I think that fundamentally is just there's a huge missed opportunity here to actually shape your thoughts around risk to be more relevant to decision support, supporting leaders in organizations make critical decisions rather than make reports that nobody reads. I'm sorry for being a bit cynical here, but having been nerdy around this topic for the better half of 20 some years, it's sort of I think something needs to change here.
So one of the things that I picked up out of our conversations is when you treat risk as avoidance, right, and compliance, you're not taking risk at its full expression where it can be a strategic advantage, right? That when you're looking at something that is potentially risky, right, or has inherent risk with it, you can take it out to increase operational efficiency, but you can also look at risk as something that's a strategic advantage.
Yeah.
And then that's once you get into this compliance and risk avoidance mentality, the upside is completely obscured.
Absolutely. And I think that's where the topic of risk management, it has a very bad reputation. I think there's a rebranding effort required. But you're absolutely right. Risk management has been held hostage, I would say, by the sort of the approaches of the audit world, where the audit and controls has its own value. But that has sort of been taking over the world of risk, and that's been focusing on the risk avoidance part, right? And it's the same thing with the legacy of insurance. A lot of the risk thinking comes from insurance, but insurance is also about sort of minimizing losses, right? And it's a very reactive mechanism. It's valuable, but it's very reactive. And I think what's needed is a more proactive approach to actually look at the strategic advantage of your thoughts on risk and how to work with that as a capability more than anything else, right?
Do you have an example of an organization that you think is beginning to act in a way that would be consistent with your thinking relative to risk management, is beginning to look at it holistically?
Yeah, so two examples maybe pop up. I think now I mentioned General Motors before, right? And as you all know, General Motors is a very, very large organization, and trying to get their head around all their types of risk is, of course, a daunting enterprise in itself to try and do that. But what they realized years ago was that they need to split their focus a little bit. They still needed some sort of reporting to cover off sort of corporate governance and reporting requirements, listing requirements, and all of that. So they did that, but tried to do that very, very efficiently and very lean. Then what they pivoted into was actually to try and do more what we call decision support, which was what are the tools and mechanisms and methodologies that you can basically make a buffet and have leaders choose from. So if a leader comes and says, hey, we are looking at a regulatory pressure in China, what do we do? Okay, we have an opponent here that we may not fully understand their ways of thinking and how to work through this. So can we use wargaming as a methodology to try and analyze what would be the potential next steps of the regulator, as an example, right? So now we're not talking about heat maps and reporting and all that anymore. Now we're actually talking about what are the tools and mechanisms out there that you can deploy to understand uncertainty better and then make informed decisions, right? I think it comes with a paradox, right? Because sometimes you want to do a bit more analysis, but you cannot go into sort of full-blown consulting mode and do analysis paralysis, right? Because then you're never going to get there. So I don't know if you remember years ago, Rita McGrath, she wrote a book on the end of competitive advantage. And in that, she said, right now, it's the age of fast and roughly right. And I think we need to get back to that. I really like that little nugget there, because that's what risk management should cater for. Risk management should not go into that trap of analysis paralysis, right? Yeah. And that's what General Motors have tried as an example, right? Is to how can we fast deploy some tools and methodologies to allow leaders to think through a scenario, think outside the box with something they're not trained in, something they don't have. So how do you have a team of experts that can go facilitate those types of dialogues? So that's an example from General Motors, right? I have another one, Kevin, from Open Society Foundations. If you know that, it's the George Soros Foundation that's trying to create vibrant democracies around the world, right? And there it was much more about, they work in really risky environments around the world. So there it was much more about how do we make the whole organization in the very, very front end aware of risky decisions and risky situations and make informed choices when they're out there. So how can we train that into the organization rather than thinking about a head office reporting exercise, right? So two different examples to that.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds to me like in the General Motors example, they're beginning to move toward, the notion of OODA loops, right? That they're trying to work in fast decision cycles, or observe, orient, decide, act, which is let's see, Boyd, forgot his first name, all right, but
Colonel John Boyd.
Yeah, thanks, Richard Boyd, all right. That indeed, that's good, and sitting a little bit at the edge of it hasn't happened yet, maybe some scenario planning, right? For both organizations that you mentioned, standing in things that haven't happened yet, but you want to be able to have the signals and be able to detect, right? And we've thought about it. Those are all good practices, and that's more process than department, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is one of the big issues in risk management, right? When we go in and look at the list of risk that organizations have, or their risk register, or whatever it's called, the biggest mistake we see in there is often that it's full with problems and issues. There's a definition thing here we need to work with, and that is risk is not an existing problem, because by definition, a risk should not have occurred yet, right? And I think that's a problem that a lot of organizations have in how they approach risk management. It's basically just the list of dirty laundry. Because if you go out and facilitate a discussion and ask stakeholders, what are your key risks? They are not creative enough in their thinking, right? So what they come up with is their list of current issues and problems they have to try and bring attention to that. And then you, by nature, make your risk efforts reactive, because it's all happened, right? And then you're actually doing problem solving or crisis management rather than risk management, right? So we need to be coming into that more proactive mode and when we talk about risk and come up with that definition between issues and risk, right?
Yeah, I mean, what you're leaning into, which I like a lot, is that if you define the taxonomy of these are the things that are risky, and so we're going to go ahead and audit and have compliance against these things, it gives you no peripheral vision on other things that aren't on that list, and being resilient enough to react quickly when a black swan event happens.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of you need to define the skill set according to what you're trying to achieve here, right? And you're absolutely right. There's something about the we tried in organizations to delineate between three different buckets that we're talking about. One is the what we call the persistent risks. So it's the risk that's inherent in your business model and how you're operating. So whether that's the risk of a fire or health and safety, whatever, we know they're there and they're well managed and typically distributed out in the org chart and so on. It's not a big thing. You can go and monitor that every now and then. Then you got what we call the strategic risks, which is more, okay, the change initiatives or must-win battles to achieve our strategic vision. What are the uncertainties and risks related to that? Can we articulate them stronger and actually start to analyze those in a proactive manner? And then the last bucket is the emerging risks. So that's sort of, let's think outside the box, further ahead into the future. What are some of the things that we don't see in our daily operations, but somebody should pay attention to, right? What is out there that we should be aware of? And that's where scenario thinking, foresight, all of these different, very well-known methodologies can be deployed to use, right? I just think a lot of people are not aware of how to work with this. And that hence back to the capability discussion, right? How do we inform people in organizations that they can use all these tools and techniques to help them, right? I think that's a major thing in them.
Yeah. So we're going to be going to questions. Think about what you want to ask Martin in a few minutes. What I'm thinking now is, how do you get someone to move from rigid to resilient, right? In this space, are you doing this through workshops? Are you doing this through education for the C-suite, or is it throughout the organization? What is the change management and transition management that you think works in this space?
Yeah, there's different approaches, right? I think there's certainly a board and C-suite discussion to be had here. Unfortunately, I think what's happening in many organizations is that they can't really think beyond the next quarterly result. So this short-termism is a major obstacle for discussing future risks, right? So there's something there that you need to work with and push people to say, when do we have real conversations about what's coming out in the future that we need to think about, right? And that back to your point earlier, Kevin, about both the opportunities and the risk side of that discussion needs to happen, right? So at the moment, you see all the conversations about AI and for the informed people, that has been around for years. Right now, many organizations are only just realizing that maybe this is something we should start to talk about, right? So it's just an example of, well, if you'd had a little bit more foresight, you would know that this is coming, and what does the potential impact, upside, downside to your business model, what does that look like, right? And now companies are scrambling to figure out where they're at in that one. And they could have had years of preparing that, right? And taking into a competitive advantage rather than something that might risk their business model, right? So I think there's some discussions to be had at the top of organizations, but that capability journey, I think, is an interesting topic to say, how do we actually go teach and empower people throughout the organization to make risky decisions? Right? I think that's where we need to go, because if everything has to filter back up through a hierarchy, it's going to take too long in the world that we live in today, right? So risky decisions cannot be dependent on an annual wheel, an annual process where we have to escalate back up to top management to make decisions. We have to empower down into the organizations. And that's where, yeah, there is a sort of an academy approach there in teaching an organization what that actually means, right?
Yeah, I mean, if the risks are generally known to all the participants in a particular market space, then the one person or the one entity that is willing to take the risk and change the rules for everybody else is actually thinking like a general instead of like a lieutenant, right? Is that, they're willing to do something that the competition can't see, because they're kind of like, why are they doing that? Right? And yeah, great risk also potentially can have large rewards if you're willing to bet that way.
Absolutely. And I think now you mentioned the word before, Kevin, on resilience, right? Because yes, you can make big bets and make big choices, but I think you can also like resilience is well, it's not new, it's been around for a long time, but it's becoming a little bit more of a buzzword these days due to supply chain issues and so on. And I think when we look at resilience, right, we need to think about resilience by design. So how do you build your business model, your end-to-end value chain, your relationships with your suppliers, your relationship with your customers? How do you make that resilient, right? So what does risk mean for your customers? If you can't answer that, then I think your risk management setup is about to fail, right? So there's something about resilience and making your organization more robust by design, right? And that's another conversation where a lot of organizations, they keep getting surprised, for example, with the supply chain issues and so on. And you can't be surprised if you only got one supplier in China that you might have trouble, right? But back to the short-termism and profit optimization, right?
Yeah, you bet. I'm going to invite my co-host, Mike McGuire, in. Mike, you've been tracking our conversation. What's occurring to you?
Well, I mean, thank you very much for that, for this, Mark, for this intro, and to the team and your work. You would early on, you talked about, I can't remember exactly the phrase "good enough," right? When I'm estimating planning, what I've seen, and I'm curious of your thoughts, is in the last 20 years I've been working, I've seen risk, this whole issue of risk management as, basically the stand-in for we don't know how to make a decision. But I've seen that also kind of at the same time, more and more, that paralysis being exacerbated by Kevin and I have talked about this, right? The kind of the tyranny of measurement. Right. And, if I can't measure it just exactly correctly down to the gnat's ass, well, then I better not, I can't make a decision. Is that, I don't know if that's just an observation I had. I was curious what your reaction to that is. I'm for measurement, but I think oftentimes it becomes a way to not make a decision.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think there was a famous quote once that for every one of our failures, we had awesome spreadsheets, or whatever it was called, right? And I think that's part of the challenge here. If you go into that deep analysis on things, when you go in very nerdy in the world of risk management at the moment, there's a huge conflict inside risk management, and it's between people who believe that a more qualitative approach is good enough, and then those who believe that you have to do more quantitative approaches, analysis, measurements on risk, right? I think the verdict is still out a little bit, but the side of quantification and measurement is sort of arguing that if you don't have data and numbers on things, then you can't trust it. But when you then look at the history of business, well, most major decision in an organization is made on gut feeling, right? It's made on what people believe is the right approach. So I'm not sure I fully get it. I think back to the fast and roughly right, it's probably the way to go. There's a competitive advantage in that if you dare, right? So it's about bravery when you make risky decisions as well, right? And not just analysis and measurement.
Where does prototyping fit into that?
Right.
What was that, sir?
Where does prototyping fit into fast and roughly right?
Yeah, I think it's back to sort of the I guess the historic ambition of agile, right? And say, how can we move faster and make prototypes and fail fast, right? But maybe fail once and not again and again and again, right? But also fail small and not huge, right? So I think that's something in there as well. How can you deconstruct big decisions into smaller decisions, right? And then a little bit like private equity, then you fund it as you go, right? Rather than make one huge decision gate at the end on go live or no go live with 600,000 customers or whatever, and a big bang approach to a waterfall transformation, whatever it is, right? That's very risky, but organizations keep doing it. Why can't we de-risk that by making smaller decisions along the way? I think there's something in there about prototyping, how you can do that smarter, right?
Mike, do you have a follow-on question, or do we?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think where do we? One of the things as you guys were going back and forth, it occurred to me is some of that, as you approach about prototyping, right? Is I can rough it out now, I can get a little field testing. Okay, we can make some certain refinements, make it iterative, but having the ability to measure the performance of the thing in increments as it develops, spot on. I think some of this, to me, I come back to that phrase that I've never. It's a software development phrase, minimum viable product, right? And then we throw it out there and we're charging people money for it while we improve it, which is an interesting trade-off, right? But I think when we think about outside of certain software products, a service, etc., that MVP approach seems to have creeped in more, that, you know, specifically for software than for hardware and other products, right? It's kind of affected those to where I get a minimally, you know, an MVP product out, and I don't, the whole refinement, it's like, well, it's good enough, it's making money now, let's just keep it operating, right? As opposed to developing it to the point where it's utterly refined. I don't know if that's an observation I had, that, you know, I see some of that kind of creeping into that software development thing, into some of these other areas that I think oftentimes stop that, you know, metered approach that's based on hitting certain, you know, the product evolving such a way that it hits certain, you know, design points till it's perfected. Sorry for rambling there, but that's been kind of my observation, Kevin, is I think we're seeing some of this software development kind of thing affect other areas that I'm not sure is particularly good. And we avoid some of the refinements that we see in product development.
Okay. Martin, anything you want to react to in that thought, and then we're going to go to questions from the audience.
I think you're right, Mike. That's a that is a challenge, right? And I think it's a little bit back to some of your world as well, Joe, on sort of the customer experience here, right? And do we forget the customer, right? So if you do make an MVP, is that good enough from a customer perspective, or is it just good enough because then we could punch something out and start to get money, right? And I think you run the risk of putting out an MVP that's not good enough, right? And then you can sort of destroy the whole value proposition you were trying to do, right? I've done a fair amount of work with Husqvarna. They make the robotic lawnmowers and chainsaws and so on, right? And
motocross bikes too.
Yep. And Husqvarna is one of the oldest companies in the world, right? They're 335 years old or whatever as a company. And they asked me for help on risk management. And I said, I have nothing on risk management in terms of you guys, right? Because you've been around for that long. You know how to manage risk. But what was very interesting for them was they invented the robotic lawnmower, right? Which is really picking up now. But that whole market got destroyed by John Deere years ago, because they put out a prototype that was simply not good enough. And then people said, we're not buying it. And that destroyed the market for everybody. And then they've been trying to claw their way back into it, right? So that's just an example of an MVP or a product that's failed, right? And I think that's the risk you can run in that regard.
So I see Mac Turner has his hand up, and we're going to questions from our gathered innovation catalyst. So Mac, what's on your mind for Martin today?
And very interesting discussion. And I come out of the world of financial services, but I'm going to try to ask a question, and if it gets convoluted, forgive me. Not in financial services, but to your point of little decisions along the journey. So recently, and we're all aware of this story, a major global beverage firm made a marketing promotional decision. Now, if it had been successful, it would have gone down into marketing history as both bold and empowering. However, it was horribly not successful. You know, we talk about managing a portfolio of risk, but this was a great example of one decision bringing down the brand. Now, from people inside that conversation, I recently learned that part of the story was a design of the risk management process issue, where the brand evaluation committee only evaluated decisions that cut across multiple channels. And this particular decision was deemed to be a single channel decision. Now, granted, there is no such thing as a single channel decision anymore.
Nope.
But that flaw in their decisioning process aside, how do you think that approach you were describing of little decisions along the way would have prevented that situation from occurring?
Yeah, I think maybe two things to that. There's just a challenge in there, Matt, right? That once you go live through whatever channel it is today, it can take off as a wildfire, right? And therefore, can you really make a small decision, right? By the time you punch it out there and go live, you're done, right? Either it's live, and then now you have to roll with it, right? So I think the go live point, that's where it's a point of no return. Leading up to that, it's just, I'm not sure how you can deconstruct that situation into smaller decisions, right? Because it seems like that's what they're already trying to do. But there's something about then making the capability of the people who are managing that process and say, how do they go through their thinking? And are they thinking broad enough 360 around whatever they're about to go live with? Have we considered the implications of this thinking, right? So I was speaking at a conference recently on risk, and one of the other speakers was from Target. And they were explaining how they do reputational risk management, right? And one of the things they said was they've really struggled to not be creative enough in their thinking about consequences of their choices. So as an example, they have a long history of supporting and have products related to the LGBT plus community, and they're sticking to that. What they hadn't really thought through is what that meant for physical safety for their employees in their stores. They were simply not creative enough to think that people around the country would show up and beat the out of their employees for the choices in their product catalog that they have, right? And now that has implications for how they do safety and physical security in stores and so on, right? But there's something going back here to say, with that example you have, Matt, how could they be more creative in their thinking about the potential consequences, right? And then figure out, is it worth the risk that we are running right now?
Exactly. And Target, of course, had another set of problems with it not thinking through the implications of some of its predictive analytics. And I won't go into the details. It's another well-known story. But I think that theme of how do we think through the unintended consequences of what seems to be a brilliant strategy, and how do we also separate the someone very senior wants this from someone very junior has to be able to say no.
Yeah.
Has to be worked into the process.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I see Joe Pine has his, oh, go ahead, finish your thought.
No, maybe just one comment on that. I think you're right, Mac, that you need to have room for diversity in your thought process, right? And also how you challenge hierarchy. Because otherwise you're running the risk of very few people can make the decision. But there's also going back to the very old school blue versus red team, right? The devil's advocate, the 13th man. I think all these concepts are known, but are they really deployed into critically challenging the decisions that we are making, right? And I think that there's room for improvement there, right?
I just want to comment that over 20 years ago, I wrote a chapter in my book that said that in crisis culture is destiny. And it relates to what we're talking about here, because at the end of the day, when you're stressed and there's something that's going to be bad outcomes for your customers, you can either do the Pinto response, which is let's calculate how many deaths are likely to occur before we make the fix, all right? Or do we do what Johnson & Johnson did at the time during the Tylenol crisis, which is we took the Hippocratic Oath. We will do no harm, right? So it's an immediate response that you take it off the market, out of the market, even though it's going to have some financial consequences. The long-term goodwill that you're buying protects your, status in the marketplace. So there's no need to respond. I'm just saying, I spent a lot of time immersed in that topic, and we know that the organizations that behave that way and treat risk management in those situations, all right, on a favorable way for customers, are the ones that have had a tendency to survive over a long period of time. Joe, over to you.
Well, I have several off-point questions, but I'll keep to the on-point ones. One, just a comment when you're talking about minimally viable products, Martin, made me think that what it really means is barely viable, maybe. right? And yeah, a lot of good has been done, but you're exactly right in that. And then the conversation you just had on the ability of somebody down in the organization to say no relates to the question that I had thought of, which is how broad is risk in your thinking? Because I was actually going to say is that I think one of the biggest risks for companies today is that people don't have the ability to be able to say no, have the ability to make a difference, that they get edicted from on high. And I think for companies to be able to thrive on the long term, you need a way of managing that unleashes the potential of people and lets them do what it takes. And management basically has to let go of those sorts of things. I mean, I seriously think that's like the number one risk for companies today is they don't do those sorts of things.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, Joe. It's sort of coming back to the behavioral aspects of this, right? But also the hierarchical situation, and you can see the different countries have different cultures, and different companies have different cultures, right? But I think one of the key maybe differences between the average startup company and the bigger, more well-established corporates, right, is that the big corporates, they tend to default into this hierarchy model where you have to go and ask for permission for everything, right? And that means they become very slow, and they also start to have different agendas and so on, right? And I think we need to get back to something where it is the empowerment, it is the front line that can make risky decisions as well, and challenge top decision makers, right? But that's not what we see in society today, right? I think there's more and more people out there that get offended and all kinds of things if you challenge their viewpoint, right? And we're probably walking in the wrong direction. Sorry.
And when you think about resilience, I would think that having a more modular organization would like automatically make it more resilient. And wanted to see if you thought of that or help make it come about.
Yeah, so we actually just did a project with the Danish Technical University on resiliency in green transition projects. Because I think a lot of the green transition projects are never taken off because they don't fit the mold of the standard business case, and therefore they're never approved. And I think if you want to do that, it's new technology, it's new ways in the market, and you don't know, it's too risky. So we're thinking through how can you de-risk green transition projects and make them more resilient from the beginning. And I think modular is certainly a thing in here in thinking about adaptability as an approach. So how do you make your organizations and your choices more adaptable as you move along, right? So we may have the MVP approach, we may have the prototyping, but there's also something about adaptability and how fast can you change direction, and there modular becomes interesting, right? Whether that is you build a new factory and you make it modular so you can add to it as you grow, or whatever it is, right? Like we had the case of the Maersk Center for Zero Carbon Shipping that we've worked with, and they are trying to decarbonize the shipping industry, right? But they've had to take a portfolio approach and then modularize whatever they're doing. So new fuel in ships, that has to be a modular approach because we don't actually know what will be the dominant fuel of the future yet for shipping, right? So therefore they have to be able to shift out the engine part, but still keep the ship the same. And that's where they're sort of thinking around adaptability in their design processes, right? As an example. So I think there are different ways to think about resiliency that we need to be better at exploring, because that's a very, very interesting topic across different business models, across different processes, and so on, that we need to work more on.
I saw Richard Boyd had his hand up before. Richard, you want to jump in?
Well, yeah, and I've got a long set of notes here. I'm trying to figure out how much you want me to say, but having worked in really large organizations like Lockheed Martin and the Department of Defense, and working as a serial and parallel entrepreneur, risk is definitely our friend, but I see it dealt with in a lot of different ways with different organizations. I just a couple of quick points. I spoke at a conference at the Eisenhower Fellow thing last week where I talked about how we humans are now building a lot of really complex systems that are so complex we don't fully understand them, much less have any hope of being able to govern or manage them. And that that level of risk is something that people just aren't comfortable with.
Mhm.
I just rejected a contract right before this with a big healthcare provider who sent me a master services agreement where all, you know, they're a multi-billion-dollar company, but they put all of the risk on my little firm.
Mhm.
And I just said, no. And she said, what do you mean, no? You don't want to do business with us? It's like, no, I very much do. But you just gave me an infinite amount of risk with no top end on it with things that aren't fully within my control. And that you know, how we actually manage that risk should be a lot more weighted towards you, multi-billion-dollar company, and not me, million-dollar company, right? Like that is not level. The other thing that's top of mind is, you know, for several years now at this conference in Orlando, I've helped manage this thing called a Black Swan event. And every single year I have to deal with someone who stands up and says, how do we prevent black swans? And I always laugh out loud and say, you don't understand what a black swan is. A black swan by definition is something we can't anticipate. And the only answer to it, as you guys have already discussed, is building really resilient systems and organizations and structures where the people closest to the problem are able to absorb the new information and maybe even react to it before it goes up through the hierarchy. And that's the only thing you can do, is build resiliency in, because there will be more disruption. And you know, like I said, we're building a lot of things we can't control anymore. I have more to say, but I'll just pause there because I don't know how much you want me. But the last idea is, at Lockheed, as Kevin knows, we created this thing, like DARPA has their technology readiness levels, TRLs. So we created innovation readiness levels, and that has a lot to do with, you know, what is an organization's sort of appetite for new ideas and risk and change, and how are they structured. I think it might be interesting to do something around sort of a risk tolerance level or something. Like let's assess your organization. How ready or able are you to take on things like new research and development contracts and or projects? And you know, if you look at nuclear power, no tolerance whatsoever. And I worked in that industry, and they just like zero tolerance for anything that's a change or new or might introduce any kind of risk. And yes, with software, if I'm building an app that I'm putting out on the iPhone, MVP is totally fine. Move fast and break things, still fine there, but it is overused, as someone said, because that is not the right thing to do in a lot of other industries. You don't want to move fast and break if it's a, you know, sort of a critical industry.
Well, Rich, I would agree. I'd say it is okay in in a lot of contexts to move fast and break things, right? As long as everybody is in on that, right? And has been kind of, I mean, I think we can think of lots of markets where, okay, long-term financial planning, yeah, moving fast and breaking things probably isn't a good idea, right? But as long as the customer base, the install base and any potential customer understands this kind of product or service lends itself to growing better by taking that approach. Again, as long as nobody's surprised, I think moving fast and breaking things is okay, as long as everybody's filled in on that and isn't having to lose money.
Yeah, it's loose connections and running code, and then start looking at it and get the feedback loop going from there. As long as it isn't connected to anything that might kill somebody. All right, I'll pause.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Well, let me build on that, because I've gone through that prototyping deal, and I've been through minimal viable product. And Mike said something I think that's really critical, is that your customer has to be in on it.
Right.
They've got to be part of the joke. Because if they're not, then you've lost your innovator market, you've lost your early adopter market. And in the social media environment today, they're going to tell 10 million of their friends.
That's right.
So if you don't have those first waves of customers in on the activity, they get some benefit from the brokenness, then you've lost that future market of early and later adopters, because you would have been criticized to death by then.
Yeah, yeah. Martin, any summary thoughts before I go to Doug Hoolan, who's going to ask the next question? Thanks, Mac.
Maybe just on what Richard was mentioning, right? I think that On the nuclear example, I think, yes, that's probably there. That's one of the industries you don't want to fool around with. But a lot of others, I think there's actually room to challenge that a little bit. And I think SpaceX is actually an example of how they challenged NASA on the approach to rockets, right? Where they were willing to fail fast. Of course, the only reason they could do it was because they got one guy who was willing to pay for it, right? But it's just, I think they proved that they could actually speed up their innovation cycles quite rapidly by accepting risk tolerances that were much, much higher and being willing to fail fast, right? And it's always interesting to see how can you challenge your own business model with thinking like that, right? Yeah, it's not all industries, but some, I think they're ripe for that kind of thinking, right?
Yeah, well, and the other side of that is, if you decide to use 3D printing to make a submersible, right? That's probably, not a good idea, right? Is their innovation where there was a large body of knowledge to tell you, how to do it, something safely and what the right materials are. That is innovating, right, in a perilous way, right?
Yeah.
So we saw the outcome there. Hello, Doug. Welcome.
Yeah, I appreciate what you're sharing. The comment of move fast, break things. When I give presentations on responsible AI, I add or pay lots of fines. So like GDPR is a good example where the #1 fine right now, the winner of the largest fine so far is 1.2 billion euros by Meta. And, so as we're looking at the EU AI Act and responsible AI, you can move fast, you can break things, but if you don't have proper governance and policy, you can pay lots of fines and go bankrupt at a business. In fact, I was talking to a person yesterday who's a consultant and focusing on, governance and policy. And, especially all these startups that when there's, if you go at a list, there's like 200 or 2000, AI companies out there. So how many of them are following policy today? How many people that use the internet today are breaking laws? Fortunately, a lot of them don't get in trouble, but some of them do. And, there's that aspect. And then I guess my question to you is, as we look at, policy and risk tolerance, like around AI, I don't know if you're familiar with the EU AI Act, but, is there better ways to, create governance of risk and say, okay, this is what you're doing. And, oh, by the way, what you're doing has this risk of either paying fines or breaking laws or causing harm. And, so that very quickly people can understand the risk and say, okay, am I willing to do this risk or not, right?
Yeah, I think it's a very good example, right? And I think I'm not too much into the AI Act, but I've done some work around the European banking authorities sort of outsourcing, EBA outsourcing, right, guidelines for the financial sector. What's very interesting with that is I think we're missing an element of trust, right? That has been broken down over years and years and years, where the regulatory requirements, they have the intent of protecting society, protecting the financial viability of a country or whatever it might be that they're after, right? But the requirements they then put into policy and regulation is very standardized and doesn't actually cater for the intent they're trying to achieve. When you then got the opponent, which is maybe the financial service sector or whatever, they're then trying to live up to the requirements, but they're trying to dodge the fines. And by doing that, they just create a lot of paperwork that the regulator can then look at and say, okay, but when you look across both sides, they are not managing the risk better, no matter what they're doing, right? And I think that there's something there in that handshake between the regulatory requirements and the objective we're actually trying to get after. That's problematic because on the other side, whether it's businesses or banks or whatever it is, they're actually not living up to the intent here. So, for example, one of the big banks on outsourcing, they have to now explain what are all the risks in an outsourcing arrangement. And today, most banks, that's what they do, right? They have almost empty shells, right? Where there's nothing in it, everything is outsourced to third parties. So the risk of the bank is, of course, is that if any of the third parties fail, then the bank potentially can fail. And then that's what they're trying to avoid and get documented that that can't happen. But the way they do it is by asking for long list of risks. And they're then just providing hundreds and hundreds of pages on heat maps and documentation for risk controls. But they're not actually managing the risks. Because the banks, how are they going to manage AWS or Google or Microsoft in terms of their whole digital infrastructure, right? They can't. They can ask you to have a backup data center and so on, but it's just there's a flawed logic in there, and I think that's the regulator has in the various industries have a huge thing in front of them to figure out how do they make better regulation that will actually allow for the real management of risk. And how do they make faster regulation? Because I think the AI area is very interesting right now. I think there's a huge discussion going on, right? Is it safe where we're moving? Should they do more to prevent continuous development of all of this right now? Or are we into some Hollywood scenarios in the future where the AI will take over and all that? Or where are we, right? And I'm not sure that regulators are able to act fast enough. We've seen it on different other things with alcohol, tobacco, weapons, and so on in different societies around the world, but the regulators are way too slow.
Yeah, there was a good discussion this morning that said that because they're treating the internet like a utility in the EU under a regulatory regime versus more open market in the United States, that the US was able to much more quickly scale up bandwidth opportunity during COVID than the EU did, right? And so there are some interesting dynamics there. I'd like to, Richard Boyd's been putting some interesting stuff in chat, but I want to ask Joe Pine something. Joe, you're an experience expert. Duh.
I hope so.
Yeah, at a planetary level.
He literally wrote the book.
You wrote the book. Well, he co-wrote the book. And here's my question is, don't you have to have an element of risk to make an experience actually poignant?
Yep.
So talk about that for a moment, because a business that has completely de-risked itself might be pretty milquetoast.
Right, exactly. I often tell clients that you need to save 20% of your budget for after you come out with the experience. No matter how much piloting and prototyping and testing, whatever you do, you cannot predict how human beings will react in any experience. So you've got to be willing to then take those initial things and spend more money to make it right, make it better, make it more engaging, and so forth. So there is an inherent risk in whether it's going to be a good offering or not. You don't know. I remember once the only time in my life I ever wrote a speech for somebody was I forget his name. It's Sam Nazarian, SLS Hotels out in LA and that. And he is asked to give a speech at a medical convention of some sort to doctors and that. And they had a speechwriter and it just didn't work out. And for some reason they thought of me. I talked to those folks. And I said, okay, I'll do it just for the fun of it. But and when I came, one of the key construct I came up with is that these are all research doctors, they're scientists. And I said that what SLS Hotels does is every one of the places is unique. It's not a chain, right? They're all unique hotels and the bars and et cetera. I said, and every one is a hypothesis, right? The hypothesis is if I design it this way, right, and do these things, will people come? Will they like it? Will they pay enough money and so forth? Which is the same, of course, what the scientists do. They make a hypothesis and then they test it, right? His tests are always one-off, but there is an inherent risk that your hypothesis is wrong, no matter how much you do ahead of time to be able to figure out. So I think it is inherent with experiences. And I'm increasingly focused on going beyond experiences to transformations, which was in the original book, chapters 9 and 10. But we wrote a Harvard Business Review article on it last January, February, a year ago. And where it is about the outcomes. right? And they're outcomes you can't guarantee. So I thought of it when Richard was talking about the, all the risk put on his little company versus the billion-dollar company on things he can't control. Well, transformations, you inherently can't control it because the person has to transform themselves. You're just the guide, right? As the saying goes, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink, no matter what you do. But yet the best way to achieve that outcome is actually to charge for the outcome, which does involve risk. Like I know some companies that charge a transformation guarantee where they put some part of their income at risk based on the customer's outcome. And that's the best way to get the chances of transformation to increase.
Thanks for that. I'm going to reach back in your background, Richard Boyd, for a moment and say, part of your business, I think, could be gamification of risk. Could you, put people into the worlds that would make it possible to experience the risk in a safe way, right? Which goes back to training an airline pilot or something.
That's what flight simulation is. Yeah.
Isn't it, appropriate to think about using game-like technologies to augment your ability to increase your ability to make a better risk decision?
No, it's funny. I'm having a side conversation right now about medicine, and that's the conversation we've had for a long time. And it's like, why don't we have complete simulations of the entire sort of healthcare system? And I'm like, well, because flight, as complex as it seems, there's like 25 variables in the air, and there's only so many variables. So it's a bounded sort of problem, even though weather and things like that seem complex. But when you go into medicine, it is, 3 to 4 orders of magnitude more complex in terms of all the things that could happen. So building a full simulator of all of those things and putting people in it is difficult. Now you can still do bounded versions of it. And that's what we're still trying to do and get people to adopt. So I think that is possible. And I think simulation, as you know, I say this is the simulation century, and those who can model and not just predict the future, but also try to affect future outcomes through that modeling and simulation and use of AI will prevail. So I think that is absolutely part of the answer. But it's non-trivial for a lot of the really complex systems that we're pondering.
Well, we're still thinking, is this, life a simulation, right? Well, maybe somebody else, right? Martin, thank you.
It's a non-zero chance.
Yeah. We're at the top of the hour. I want to give you the last word. What do you, just to frame it up a little bit, is what would you like the world to do next about risk?
Yeah, thanks for that one. Well, I think the major thing is this: we talked about empower people to make decisions. I think that's where we have to go, and that takes some capability. It takes some gamification to teach people what their dilemmas are and so on, and how to work through some of these difficult decisions, right? And then we need to be more creative in our thinking. I know we can't predict, as Richard said, black swans and all that, but I think we can do a lot more to prepare ourselves for what's coming, right? But we need to spend a little bit more time on it and thinking through the tomorrow rather than yesterday.
All right. Well, we greatly appreciate you being with us. We wish you all the best as you continue to grow here in the Raleigh and the Research Triangle region and across the U.S. Everyone, Martin Vilso, Implement, great to have you with us. And in everything you do, be intentional. We'll talk to you next week. Cheers.
Cheers. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Martin.